They laughed at the elderly woman at the airport. Little did they know she was the new boss. Dorothy Mae Johnson never imagined that at 72 years old, she would experience the greatest humiliation of her life in broad daylight, surrounded by dozens of people who laughed at her situation without even knowing her true story. It happened when she tripped over her own right foot while passing through the executive line at Newark Airport, spilling the coffee she was holding onto the shiny Italian shoe of Richard Thompson, regional manager of Horizon Construction. The man in the navy blue suit and expensive tie looked at her with a face twisted in disgust. "What an outrage!" shouted Richard, making sure his voice echoed through the terminal. "Look what this old lady did to my shoe." Dorothy lowered her head, ashamed. Her straw hat with a black ribbon slipped slightly forward, covering part of her brown eyes that shone with held-back tears. She wore a simple beige blouse and a light blue skirt that she had bought on sale years ago. "I'm sorry, young man. It was an accident," she murmured, searching for a tissue in the worn leather bag she carried. But Richard wasn't interested in accepting apologies. He saw a perfect opportunity to impress Patricia Morgan, an important investor who was watching the airport bustle while waiting for her flight to Miami. "People like her shouldn't even be allowed in here," he said loudly, gesturing dramatically. "Just look at how she's dressed. She probably collected cans on the street to save up for the ticket." The flight attendants passing through the area began to laugh nervously, unsure how to react to the situation. Some people stopped to watch the commotion that was unfolding. Richard felt he was getting the attention he wanted and decided to continue. "I bet that ticket is fake," he continued, pointing to the envelope Dorothy held with trembling hands. "Or maybe she fished it out of the trash. These people will do anything to pretend to be someone they're not." Dorothy tried to explain herself, but her voice was too soft amid the shouting. "You don't know me to talk to me like that," she managed to say, but Richard interrupted her. "I don't need to know you, Granny. It's written all over your face where you come from," he laughed, imitating her humble way of speaking. "Hey, everyone, look how she walks." Richard began to walk hunched over, imitating Dorothy's way of moving due to the arthritis in her right knee that had bothered her for years. The people around laughed even harder, and Patricia Morgan watched everything with an unreadable expression on her face. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Dorothy felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she took a deep breath. She had been through worse things in life, and it wouldn't be an arrogant man that would make her give up on her goal that day. "Young man, I do have a valid ticket," she said, taking the ticket out of the envelope. "And it's for business class." Richard laughed out loud as if he had heard the best joke of the year. "Business class," he repeated, wiping imaginary tears from his eyes. "That's a good one. And I'm the owner of the airline." More people gathered to see what was happening. Among them was Cynthia Miller, chief flight attendant with 20 years of experience, who had noticed the commotion from the beginning. "Excuse me," interrupted Cynthia, approaching the group. "May I see your ticket, ma'am?" Dorothy handed over the document with trembling hands. Cynthia carefully examined the ticket and checked it in the system through a tablet she carried. "The ticket is correct," announced Cynthia, returning the document to Dorothy. "Seat 4A business class, purchased 3 weeks ago." The mocking smile disappeared from Richard's face. He looked incredulously at Cynthia, then at Dorothy, then back at Cynthia. "Are you sure?" "Let me see that," he said, reaching out to take the ticket. "Sir, that's the passenger's personal document," Cynthia replied firmly, "and everything is in order." Richard turned red with anger and embarrassment. Some people began whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He needed to regain control somehow. "Well, even so," he grumbled, "it's still strange. People like that don't fly business class. Must have won it in some contest or something." Dorothy put the ticket back in the envelope and headed toward the boarding line, ignoring the nasty comments. Her posture remained dignified despite the humiliation she had just suffered. Richard watched her walk away and felt he needed to do something more to regain his standing in front of Patricia Morgan, who continued watching everything in silence. "Folks, did you see that?" he said to the flight attendant still nearby. "The world is truly lost. Anyone thinks they can ride in business class these days." One of the younger flight attendants dared to disagree. "But sir, if she bought the ticket, she has every right," the young woman said. "Oh, so you're one of those who defends just anyone," Richard shot back. "I bet you don't even know who I am." The flight attendant shook her head, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm Richard Thompson, Regional Manager of Horizon Construction," he announced proudly. "One of the largest construction companies in the country. I travel every week for work and always in business class. I know who belongs in this environment and who doesn't." During the flight, Richard noticed that Dorothy was seated just 2 rows ahead of him. He discreetly watched her for some time, trying to understand how such a simple person had gotten such an expensive ticket. That's when he saw something that piqued his curiosity even more. Dorothy had taken a worn brown folder from her bag and pulled out some documents that looked important. She studied them carefully, making notes in a small notebook. Richard craned his neck, trying to get a better look. The papers seemed to contain charts and tables. There was something familiar about those documents, but he couldn't make out what it was from a distance. His curiosity grew when he noticed that one of the papers had the Horizon Construction logo on the header. How had that woman gotten confidential documents from the company where he worked? He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, pretending to go to the restroom, but actually wanting to pass by Dorothy to get a better look at the documents. When he got close to her seat, he could clearly see they were internal financial reports from the company. "Excuse me," he said, stopping by her seat. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading documents from my company." Dorothy looked up calmly and stared at him. "Your company?" she asked with a slight smile on her lips. "Yes. I've been regional manager at Horizon Construction for 8 years, Richard said, puffing out his chest with pride. "And I'd like to know how you got access to these reports." Dorothy folded the papers carefully and put them back in the folder. "All will become clear soon enough, young man," she replied gently. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to rest a bit." Richard stood there for a few seconds, unsure how to react. That enigmatic answer left him even more intrigued and bothered. How could such a simple woman have confidential documents and speak to him so calmly? He returned to his seat, mulling over the situation. For the rest of the flight, he couldn't stop thinking about the mystery of that woman. Who was she really? How had she gotten those documents? And why did she seem so calm in the face of his authority? When the plane landed in Atlanta, Richard waited anxiously to see what would happen. He was always greeted at the airport by a company driver, but today he had a very important meeting scheduled. The board had called all regional managers for an urgent presentation about changes in the company's structure. As he exited the plane, Richard noticed unusual movement in the arrival lounge. There were several well-dressed people waiting with signs and bouquets of flowers. Important executives from Horizon Construction were there, including Charles Henry Sanders, the financial director, and Amanda Reynolds, the human resources director. Richard waved at them, hoping they were there to greet him, but was surprised when no one returned the gesture. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else. That's when he saw Dorothy coming out of the arrival area, still in her simple clothes and straw hat. To his complete surprise, all the executives approached her. "Mrs. Dorothy," exclaimed Charles Henry, bowing respectfully. "It's an honor to have you here with us." Richard was dumbfounded. That simple woman he had humiliated at the airport was being treated with extreme reverence by the top executives of his company. "The pleasure is mine, Charles," replied Dorothy with a warm smile. "I hope we can work together to improve many things around here." Amanda Reynolds approached and handed a bouquet of white flowers to Dorothy. "On behalf of all employees, we want to welcome you," said Amanda. "We're looking forward to hearing your proposals for change." Richard approached the group, still trying to understand what was happening. That's when Patricia Morgan, the investor who had witnessed the humiliation at Newark Airport, appeared walking toward them. "Aunt Dorothy," exclaimed Patricia, hugging the lady affectionately. "How was the trip?" "Very enlightening, my dear," replied Dorothy, casting a meaningful look in Richard's direction. "I learned many important things about people's character." Charles Henry noticed Richard's presence and addressed him. "Richard, I'm glad you made it," said the director. "I want to introduce you to Mrs. Dorothy May Johnson, our new chairwoman of the board." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The simple woman he had publicly humiliated was actually his new boss. His mind began to process the possible consequences of his actions. "Chairwoman," he managed to stammer, his voice choked. "That's right," confirmed Amanda Reynolds. "Mrs. Dorothy acquired 60% of the company's shares over the last 6 months. She's here to implement a complete restructuring." Dorothy observed Richard calmly, showing no resentment. "Do you know Mr. Richard, Mrs. Dorothy?" asked Charles Henry, noticing the look between them. "We met during the trip," she replied diplomatically, "and it was a very revealing experience." Richard tried to compose himself and extended his hand to greet her, forcing an embarrassed smile. "Mrs. Dorothy, I didn't know who you were," he stammered. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" She interrupted gently. "And the other people you don't know? How do you treat them?" Patricia Morgan approached the group and spoke directly to Richard. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it?" she said with a cold smile. "I'm Patricia Morgan, Mrs. Dorothy's niece, and also an investor in the company. I witnessed your entire performance at Newark Airport." Richard paled. Now he understood why the woman had observed everything in silence. She was evaluating his behavior and reporting everything to the new chairwoman. "Mrs. Patricia, I can explain." He tried to justify himself. "There's nothing to explain," Dorothy cut him off. "Your actions spoke for themselves. Now let's go to the company. We have a lot of work ahead of us." The group headed to the cars waiting outside the airport. Richard was instructed to accompany them to the company headquarters, where the new management presentation meeting would take place. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, during the ride to the company, Richard tried to process everything that had happened. How could he have been so foolish as to publicly humiliate the person who would become his boss? And what terrified him even more, what would the consequences be? When they arrived at the headquarters of Horizon Construction, a 15-story mirrored building in downtown Atlanta, Richard noticed unusual activity. Employees were gathered in the hallways, whispering among themselves about the arrival of the new president. Dorothy was led to the main conference room on the 14th floor. It was a spacious environment with a mahogany table for 20 people, windows offering a panoramic view of the city, and a giant screen for presentations. Gradually, the regional managers, supervisors, and coordinators arrived for the meeting. Everyone seemed curious and apprehensive about the changes that were coming. When everyone was settled, Charles Henry took the floor. "Colleagues, I would like to formally introduce Mrs. Dorothy May Johnson, our new chairwoman of the board," he announced. "Starting today, she will assume the strategic leadership of the company." A general murmur spread through the room. Most of those present were seeing Dorothy for the first time and were surprised by her simple and humble appearance, so different from the usual profile of the executives they knew. Dorothy stood up slowly, leaning on the table due to her knee arthritis. She took off her straw hat and carefully placed it on the table, revealing graying hair tied in a simple bun. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said in a firm, clear voice. "I know my appearance may seem strange to some of you, but I believe true leadership isn't about expensive clothes or fancy titles, but about character and the respect we show others." Richard was sitting in a chair at the back of the room, sweating bullets and trying to become invisible. "I come from very humble origins," Dorothy continued. "My father was a construction worker, and my mother took in laundry. I learned from a young age that no matter what social position a person holds, they deserve to be treated with dignity." She paused and scanned the room with her eyes, stopping for a few seconds on Richard. "Over the past few months, I've been investigating how our company treats its employees and clients. Unfortunately, I've discovered some very concerning situations," she revealed, causing a tense silence in the room. Amanda Reynolds stood up and distributed folders to everyone present. "Inside these folders, you will find detailed reports on irregularities detected in various areas of the company," Amanda explained. "Embezzlement, workplace harassment, discrimination, and several other unacceptable practices." Richard opened his folder with trembling hands and saw his name highlighted on several pages. There were reports from employees complaining about humiliations they had suffered, records of social project funds that had been embezzled, and even recordings of situations where he had disrespected colleagues. "Mr. Richard Thompson," Dorothy called, causing everyone to turn and look at him. "Please come forward." Richard felt his legs go weak, but he managed to stand up and walk to the front of the room. All the people present watched him in silence. "Mason, according to our reports, you have a concerning history of inappropriate behavior," said Dorothy May, opening a specific folder. "Humiliation of subordinate employees, embezzlement of $15,000 intended for a Christmas project for employees' children, sabotage of colleagues' projects, and several other serious situations." Richard tried to defend himself. "Ms. Dorothy, I can explain each of these situations," he said with a trembling voice. "And how would you explain what happened today at the airport?" she asked calmly. A tomb-like silence filled the room. Richard realized there was no escape. I didn't know who you were," he murmured. "Exactly," replied Dorothy May. "You didn't know who I was, and so you thought you could humiliate me publicly. That makes me wonder how many other people you've humiliated simply because you thought you could." Patricia Morgan stood up and addressed the group. "I personally witnessed Mr. Richard's behavior at the airport," she said. "It was one of the clearest demonstrations of arrogance and lack of character I've ever seen in my life." Several employees present began whispering among themselves. Some seemed satisfied, as if finally someone was giving voice to the problems they had faced for years. Marilyn Scott, a cleaning supervisor with 15 years at the company, asked to speak. "May I speak, Miss Dorothy?" she asked timidly. "Of course, Marilyn. Feel free to speak," encouraged Dorothy May. "Everyone, I don't know if all here are aware, but Mr. Richard always treated cleaning and maintenance staff as if we were invisible," said Marilyn, gaining courage. "I've seen him throw paper on the floor on purpose so someone from our team would have to clean it up. And whenever an important client came to visit, he would order us to hide in the storage rooms so we wouldn't make a bad impression." Other people began to speak up. Jack Peterson, a safety technician, raised his hand. "I also want to speak," said Jack. "Mr. Richard always ignored my reports about safety issues at the construction sites. He said I was a dramatic person and that these things were nonsense from employees who don't want to work." One after another, people began reporting situations where Richard had shown disrespect, arrogance, or negligence. The picture that was forming was devastating. Dorothy May listened to each account attentively, taking notes in a notebook. When everyone had finished speaking, she addressed Richard again. "Mr. Richard, given everything that has been reported here, what do you have to say?" she asked. Richard was completely demoralized. His reputation had been shattered in front of all his colleagues and employees. He tried one last move. "Ms. Dorothy, I recognize that I made mistakes," he said, trying to sound sincere. "But I also brought many results to the company. My region always hit the sales targets." "That's true," agreed Dorothy May. "Your numbers are good. But tell me one thing. Is it worth having good numbers if they're built on the suffering and humiliation of other people?" Richard didn't know how to answer. "I have a proposal for you," continued Dorothy May. "You can choose between 3 options. First, immediate termination for cause. Second, accept a transfer to a trainee position with starting salary and go through a 6-month retraining program. Third, leave the company and agree to work for 3 months as a volunteer in a social project to learn about humility and respect." Richard was shocked by the options. All represented a drastic drop in his position and salary. "But ma'am, this is absurd," he exploded. "I have 8 years with the company. I have a family to support. I can't accept being demoted to a trainee." "Then choose the first or the third option," replied Dorothy May calmly. Richard looked around the room and realized there was no sympathy in his colleagues' eyes. On the contrary, many seemed pleased with what was happening. "I need time to think," he murmured. "You have until 9 tomorrow morning to give me an answer," said Dorothy May. "If you don't show up, I'll consider that you've chosen termination." The meeting ended and the employees left, commenting among themselves about everything that had happened. Richard stayed alone in the room for a few minutes, trying to process the magnitude of the trouble he'd gotten himself into. That night at home, He told everything to his wife, Hannah. She was horrified by his account of his behavior at the airport. "Richard, how could you do such a thing?" she said, disappointed. "This isn't how I raised our children. How am I supposed to explain to them that their father humiliated an elderly person?" The children, 16-year-old Peter and 14-year-old Amy, were also ashamed when they heard the story. "Dad, that was really ugly," said Amy with tears in her eyes. "That lady could have been someone's grandma." Peter, more direct, was even harsher. "Dad, you always taught us to respect our elders. How could you do that?" Richard stayed awake the entire night, reflecting on his actions. For the first time in years, he was being forced to see how his actions affected other people. The next morning, he arrived at the company at 8:30. Dorothy May was already in her temporary office reviewing documents. "Have you made your decision?" she asked when he knocked on the door. "I accept the demotion to trainee," he said, visibly humiliated. "I need the job." "Very well," replied Dorothy May, "but I want to make it clear it won't be easy. You'll have to prove you've really changed." Amanda Reynolds entered the room and handed a document to Richard. "This is your new contract," she explained. "Trainee salary, a 6-month probation period, and mandatory participation in a behavioral retraining program." Richard signed the contract with trembling hands. In the span of 24 hours, he had gone from a respected regional manager to the lowest rank in the company. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In his first days as a trainee, Richard faced extremely embarrassing situations. Colleagues who used to greet him respectfully now barely noticed him. Some even seemed pleased to see him in that situation. His first task was to work in the company's general archive, organizing documents under the supervision of Catherine Lewis, a 50-year-old employee he had completely ignored during all his years as a manager. "Mr. Richard," she said on the first day with evident irony in her voice, "you'll need to learn how the filing system works. I know when you were a manager you thought this work was beneath you, but now you'll need to understand its importance." Richard swallowed his pride and tried to focus on the work. It was humiliating, but he needed the paycheck to support his family. During the retraining program, he was required to attend lectures on respect in the workplace, moral harassment, and interpersonal relationships. In every session, he was confronted with examples of inappropriate behavior that he himself had practiced. In one of the lectures, the company psychologist, Dr. Fiona Andrews, conducted an exercise where each participant had to describe a situation where they felt humiliated or disrespected. When it was Richard's turn, he tried to avoid the exercise. "I can't remember any specific situation," he lied. "How interesting," said the psychologist. "Statistically, people who have never felt humiliated are the ones who most often humiliate others. Is there some connection?" The observation hit Richard right in the gut. He began remembering childhood situations where he had felt inferior because of the simple clothes he wore or the small house where he lived. That night he called his mother, Mrs. Abigail, who lived in a small town. "Mom, do you remember when I was a child and complained because we were poor?" he asked. "I sure do, son," she replied. "You were always ashamed of our situation. You said that when you grew up you would be rich and would never have to be around simple folks again. And you never scolded me for that. I tried, son, but you wouldn't listen. I always thought that one day life would teach you that money isn't everything." Richard realized that his current arrogance had deep roots in old complexes he had never resolved. Meanwhile, Dorothy was implementing profound changes in the company. She had created an employee appreciation program that included career plans for cleaning and maintenance staff, the creation of a daycare for employees' children, and the implementation of a channel for reporting workplace harassment. One of the most symbolic changes was the transformation of the executive dining room. Before, it was an exclusive environment for managers and directors. Dorothy determined that all employees, regardless of position, would now eat lunch in the same place. "It doesn't make sense to separate people at mealtime," she explained in a meeting. "Food brings people together. It doesn't separate them." Richard, now in a trainee position, began having lunch with cleaning, maintenance, and security personnel. At first, it was extremely uncomfortable for him, but gradually he began to know these people as human beings, not just as employees. It was during one of these lunches that he learned the story of old Oliver, a 62-year-old man who had worked as a custodian at the company for 20 years. "Mr. Richard," said old Oliver, "can I ask you a question?" "Of course, old Oliver." "Why did you never greet me all these years? I always said good morning when you passed by, but you never responded." Richard felt a pang of shame. Honestly, I didn't even notice," he admitted. "I was always in a hurry, focused on other things." "I understand," said old Oliver with a sad smile. "You know, sometimes we feel invisible, as if we don't exist." That conversation deeply marked Richard. He began to realize how many people he had ignored over the years, treating them as if they were part of the furniture. After 2 months as a trainee, Richard was called for a conversation with Dorothy. She wanted to evaluate his progress in the retraining program. "How have you been feeling during this period?" she asked. "It's been difficult," admitted Richard, "but also eye-opening. I'm starting to understand things I never noticed before." "Like what?" "Like what it feels like to be invisible, what it's like to be treated as inferior, what it's like to be afraid of losing your job," he explained. "Things I made others feel without even realizing it." Dorothy nodded her head. "And what do you intend to do with these lessons?" "I want to try to be a better person," Richard replied sincerely. "I know I can't change the past, but I can try to be different from now on." "That's a good start," said Dorothy. "But real change takes time, and it needs to be shown through actions, not just words." That same week, Richard had an opportunity to show that he was changing. During lunch, he witnessed a supervisor mistreating a cleaning employee, making prejudiced comments about her appearance. A few months earlier, Richard probably would have laughed along or simply ignored the situation. But now, after everything he had experienced, he couldn't stay silent. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, approaching the supervisor, "but I think you're being disrespectful to Mrs. Louise." The supervisor, surprised, looked at Richard. "And who are you to lecture me?" he shot back. "Weren't you the one demoted for bad behavior?" "Exactly because of that," Richard replied calmly. "Because I've done what you're doing and I know how wrong it is." The cleaning staff member, Mrs. Louise, was moved by the unexpected defense. "Thank you, Mr. Richard," she said with tears in her eyes. "No one has ever stood up for me before." That episode reached Dorothy's ears through other employees who witnessed the scene. She was impressed with Richard's attitude, but decided not to say anything to him yet. 15 weeks after the retraining period, Richard was again called to Dorothy's office for a final evaluation. "I've spoken with all your supervisors during this period," she said. "The report is very positive. People who worked with you noticed genuine changes in your behavior." Richard sighed with relief. "Does that mean I can stay with the company?" "You can," confirmed Dorothy. "But in which position depends on you." She opened a folder on the desk. "I have 3 proposals for you. First, return to regional manager, but with semi-annual psychological monitoring and interpersonal relationship goals in addition to sales targets. Second, accept a coordinator position, which is a middle ground between your previous and current position. Third, continue as a trainee, but with prospects for gradual growth as you demonstrate consistent changes." Richard thought for a few minutes before answering. "Ms. Dorothy, if I may be honest, I don't feel ready to return to management," he said. "I think I still have much to learn. I would like to accept the coordinator position if you believe I can contribute in that role." Dorothy smiled for the first time since she'd known him. "That answer shows maturity," she said. "Will you accept the coordination of the new employee integration program?" "I accept," Richard replied promptly. His new function would be to welcome newly hired employees and help them adapt to the company culture. It was work that required exactly the interpersonal skills he had developed during the retraining period. On his first day in his new position, Richard welcomed a group of 5 new employees, 2 recently graduated engineers, a secretary, a safety technician, and a cleaning assistant. "My name is Richard Thompson, and I'll be accompanying you during your first days here at the company. He introduced himself. I want everyone to feel comfortable asking any questions or reporting any problems. One of the engineers, noticing that Richard seemed older than a typical coordinator, asked a question. Mr. Richard, how long have you been with the company? 8.5 years, Richard replied. I've held several different positions and learned that the most important thing in a company isn't titles, but how we treat each other. During the integration week, Richard made a point of personally introducing each new employee to all departments, from management to cleaning, treating everyone with the same respect. Here at Horizon Construction, everyone is important, he explained. From the president to those who clean the bathrooms. A company only works well when all parts work in harmony. The cleaning assistant, Valerie, 42 years old, was surprised by the respectful treatment. Mr. Richard, may I ask a personal question? She said at the end of the week. Of course, Valerie. Have you always been like this, respectful to everyone? Richard took a deep breath before answering. No, Valerie. Unfortunately, not always. I've made many mistakes in the past, treated people poorly, been arrogant and prejudiced. But I learned in the hardest way possible that this was wrong. How so? Someone taught me a lesson I'll never forget. They showed me how awful it is to be humiliated and disrespected, and they gave me a second chance to be a better person. Valerie smiled. That person must have a very good heart to give a second chance instead of simply seeking revenge. They do, agreed Richard, thinking of Dorothy. A very good heart. 6 months after taking on the coordinator role, Richard had become one of the most respected people in the company. His transformation was seen as an example by all the employees. During the company's end-of-year party, Dorothy gave a speech about the progress made during that period. This year we implemented several important changes, she said to all the employees gathered in the hall. We created the daycare, restructured the cafeteria, implemented the employee recognition program, and established the whistleblower channel. But the most significant change was seeing that people can transform when they receive opportunity and proper guidance. She paused and looked in Richard's direction. I would like to call up here Coordinator Richard Thompson, who has become an example of how it's possible to grow and improve as a human being. Richard was surprised by the invitation, but walked to the stage to warm applause from his colleagues. Richard, would you like to share your transformation experience with everyone? Asked Dorothy. Richard took the microphone with trembling hands. Public speaking had always been easy for him, but now he felt a different responsibility. Colleagues, he began, many of you have known me for years and know I wasn't always an easy person to get along with. I was arrogant, disrespectful, and prejudiced. I treated many of you poorly, and I apologize for that. There was a respectful silence in the hall. A few months ago, I went through the greatest humiliation of my life, he continued, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me see how I was hurting other people. He looked at Dorothy before continuing. Mrs. Dorothy could have simply fired me. She had every reason to, but she chose to give me a second chance. She made me go through a difficult process, humiliating at times, but necessary. And today I can say I am a better person. The employees listened attentively. I learned that respect isn't earned with a title or salary, but with actions. I learned that all of us, regardless of our role, are human beings who deserve dignity. And I learned that it's never too late to change, as long as we have the humility to recognize our mistakes. When he finished his speech, he received a standing ovation. Several people approached him afterward to congratulate him, including employees he had mistreated in the past. Old Oliver, the janitor, was one who sought him out. Mr. Richard, I want to say I admire your courage, said the elderly man. It's not easy to admit mistakes in public. You are an example to all of us. Thank you, old Oliver, replied Richard emotionally. And I'm sorry for all the years I didn't return your greetings. From now on, whenever we meet, I will make a point of talking with you. I accept, said old Oliver with a broad smile. At the end of the party, when most employees had already left, Richard approached Dorothy. Mrs. Dorothy, may I speak with you for a minute? Of course, Richard. I want to thank you once again for everything you've done for me. he said sincerely. "I know I didn't deserve a second chance, but you gave me one, and it changed my life." Dorothy looked at him affectionately. "You know, Richard, I've also made many mistakes in my life," she confessed. "When I was young, I was very proud and sometimes treated people I considered inferior poorly. I also needed to learn to be humble. I can't imagine that." "That's true," she laughed. "The difference is, I learned that many years ago. And that's why I know change is possible. That's why I believed you could change too." "How did you manage to buy the company without anyone knowing?" "I built my wealth over 50 years of work," explained Dorothy. "I started by selling snacks outside factory gates and kept investing the money I earned. I bought small plots of land, then houses, then buildings, always reinvesting the profits. When I found out this company was facing financial difficulties and had serious management problems, I decided to step in." "But why did you choose to appear so simply?" "Because I wanted to know people's true character," she replied. "It's easy to be respectful to those we think are important. The hard part is treating well those we think are nobody. And that's exactly what you did with me that day at the airport." Richard lowered his head, still ashamed of the memory. "But look how things have changed," Dorothy continued. "Today you're one of the most beloved people in the company. This shows people can truly change when they want to." The following year, Horizon Construction became a benchmark for quality work environment. The company won several social responsibility awards and was recognized as one of the best companies to work for in the state of Georgia. Richard continued to grow professionally, always maintaining the values of humility and respect he had learned. He became the company's internal speaker, sharing his story with new employees as an example of personal transformation. His family also noticed the changes. Hannah, his wife, mentioned several times how he had become a more attentive and understanding husband. The children were proud of the father they had now. "Dad, your co-workers really like you," said Amy during a conversation at home. "At the school parent meeting, several people came to greet me saying they knew you from the company and that you were a really nice person." "I'm glad they think that, daughter," replied Richard. "But it wasn't always like this. I had to learn to be a better person." "What do you mean, Dad?" "I made serious mistakes in the past, Amy. I treated people poorly, was arrogant and prejudiced, but I was lucky enough to meet someone who taught me how to change." Peter, always curious, wanted more details. "And who was that person, Dad?" "Our company's president, Mrs. Dorothy. She taught me a lesson I'll never forget. She showed me how bad it felt to be humiliated and gave me a second chance to be better." "She must be a very wise person," commented Amy. "Yes," agreed Richard. "One of the wisest people I've ever met." 2 years after the airport incident, the company organized a big celebration for the results achieved. Productivity had increased 30%, employee turnover had decreased dramatically, and overall satisfaction was at historic levels. During the event, held at a city club, Dorothy made sure to publicly recognize people who had contributed to the company's transformation. "I'd like to call up Coordinator Richard Thompson," she announced. "Richard represents the best in humanity, the ability to recognize mistakes, learn, and transform." Richard took the stage once more, but now with much more confidence and composure. "2 years ago, I was someone you wouldn't have wanted to know," he told the audience. "I was arrogant, prejudiced, and disrespectful. I thought I was better than other people because of my position and salary." He paused and looked at Dorothy. "But a very special person taught me that true greatness isn't about humiliating others, but about helping them grow. It's not about feeling superior, but recognizing that we're all equal in dignity." The audience listened in respectful silence. "Today I can say I'm genuinely happy," Richard continued. "I have my colleagues' respect, not out of fear, but out of affection. I have a family that's proud of me, and most importantly, I have peace of mind because I know I treat everyone with the respect they deserve." When he stepped off the stage, he was surrounded by colleagues who wanted to congratulate him. Among them was Valerie, the cleaning assistant he had welcomed in the integration program. "Mr. Richard, can I say something?" she asked. "Of course, Valerie." "You changed my life too," she said emotionally. "You were the first person who treated me with respect since I started working here. You made me feel like I was important too." You are important, Valerie, Richard replied sincerely. We all are. Old Oliver also approached. Mr. Richard, I want to thank you for always greeting us now, said the custodian. It might seem silly, but it makes a huge difference in my day to know I'm noticed. The pleasure is mine, old Oliver, Richard replied, and thank you very much for giving me the chance to get to know you better. I learned a lot from you, too. At the end of the evening, as the event was winding down, Dorothy asked to speak privately with Richard. I have a proposal for you, she said. I'm listening. I'd like you to take on the role of human resources manager for the company, she revealed. I believe your personal transformation experience would be very valuable in helping other employees. Richard was surprised and moved by the offer. Mrs. Dorothy, it would be an honor, he replied. But I have one condition. What is it? I want my first project to be creating a mentorship program where more experienced employees help newcomers develop personally, not just professionally. Perfect idea, Dorothy agreed. And I already know who can be the first mentor. Who? You, she smiled. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Which moment moved you the most? Do you believe people can really change like Richard did? Leave your honest opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories like this one.